job, guys. See each other.
Might be live already, I'm not sure. We're live. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the channel. We are currently in Malmö at a conference for the European Society for the Study of Western Esotericism.
Yep.
Which means it was an amazing opportunity for me to meet up with some of my amazing friends. Zevi from Seekers of Unity, and Dr. Angela Pruka from Angela Symposium, and Dr. Justin Sledge from the channel Esoteric. This is actually the first time we meet in person, all of us, so it's really a great, wonderful moment for all of us. And we just thought we'd do like a quick live stream, maybe answer some questions, and hang out for a few minutes. So
and talk about our experience.
Yes. So feel free to ask any questions in the chat. And how do you feel, guys, about this whole?
We've had a lot of theological, philosophical discussions today. Felt like really intense.
Yeah, it's funny that normal people get together and talk about like what shows they're watching. We get together and we're like, so what kind of exotic causations do you believe in?
Right.
So what is your opinion about acausality?
Yeah, like do you believe in other kinds of causality? Like, okay.
So how do you evaluate your a priori assumptions about reality?
Right. Like, what's your we should do favorite colors or something. Like something a little lower bar, but
What's your favorite color, Justin?
you know the BMW makes this sort of gunmetal blue color, sort of halfway between like blue and gray.
Mm-hmm.
It's that color. I don't know what the name is. I think it may be called gunmetal, but I don't like the little too. That sounds too intense. But I like that spectrum somewhere just between blue and gray.
Yeah, that's nice. My wife once said that her favorite color was white because it's all the colors at the same time. And I like that answer, so I steal that sometimes. That's nice. Do you have any? Sorry.
Let me guess what Angela's favorite color is.
Well, it's less obvious than you think. My favorite color is actually a shade of purple, indigo, which is a mixture. Oh, is it? Oh, okay. Is it yours too?
Yes. Well, either white
well,
or purple.
I'm wearing amethyst, if you can see. So I really like purple, but especially the type.
On your eyes?
Yes. Especially the type of purple that goes into blue, so like indigo.
At our wedding, we had purple as our color theme. We're actually discussing colors.
I'm here. I just want to say that I'm not being rude.
I think that people want to hear more about the metaphysical stuff than what we were talking about.
I'm not on my phone here. I'm just getting questions because
sure.
I gave Zevi the job to be in charge of
monitoring
questions and comments. So if you have any for us, then
if you have questions about Sufism or paganism, shamanism, Jewish mysticism, and everything in between.
Yes. Colors, whatever.
Yeah, colors. You never told your color. What's your color?
I always love like a turquoise blue between blue and green.
Like the Hellas or
something like that. Something like a sky thrown blue. Yeah.
So very.
No, but I really did as a child, not just because of the historical or theological significance.
It's a nice color.
We could discuss the metaphysical qualities of colors.
Colors, sure.
What do the Kabbalists say about colors?
Yeah. Let's hear on colors.
Yeah.
We're getting some questions.
Yeah. But also how colors it's like, what in the world were they thinking when they wrote the Iliad, right? Like the wine dark sea. Like what in the world?
Yeah.
Like how I think it's Jackson Crawford actually wrote his whole dissertation on colors and Norse mythology.
It's interesting.
And like how even what we perceive of as various colors, like is there really such thing as orange? Like why do we pick out certain colors to give names when there's like clearly it's a spectrum,
sure.
Yeah. Right? Obviously it's a literal spectrum. But we pick out certain shades to give names. Like what are the names of all those colors in between?
We have a question from Jared33. Have you guys ever experimented with some of the ancient ritual/techniques you studied, and did you get any interesting results?
It's always these questions.
Yes.
We should do. I think for future live streams, we should just go through and be like answer do a FAQ top 5 and just answer them right out of the gate.
Right.
So my answer is easy. No.
My answer is that I only talk about these things from an academic point of view on my channel.
Nice. My answer depends on what you mean by ancient. I think the short answer is no. But because I've done field work in like Sufi context and stuff, that's not really ancient. That's more like medieval and forward. But I have participated in certain.
Well,
certain
in that sense, then me too. But I don't think it classifies as ancient because it's a contemporary word.
Right.
We were talking on the last stream we did about the ancient, very, very, very ancient practice, perhaps the oldest practice known to mankind of breathing. And I get that. I do that with interesting results. Both as a joke because I breathe and it has good results, but also because breathing, there's like new forms of.
I heard it's a fad, frankly.
No, there's a. Have any of you gotten into like holotropic breathing or like rhythmic cycle breathing, that kind of stuff?
Like yogic practices, like pranayama.
Or that, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Not really.
Those are
actually,
interesting
no.
practices.
Not to any significant degree. Like I've tried it once, not in a particular form, but like the kind of yogic breathing techniques, but not really.
I was just reading about them, some of those practices in America about mysticism just the other day on the train.
Oh, they have breathing practices?
It's like there actually are breathing practices that, there's an interesting study we made between America about what little we know from those practices. Haigon mentions breathing practices and postures, and it's like, oh yes, it's very yogic sounding.
And breathing techniques seem to be at least almost universal across different traditions and stuff. Clearly there's something very powerful that can happen when we control our breathing in different ways. You have it in Sufism and in Hinduism, you have it in Daoism all the way back in the Far East, and like hesychasm in Christianity, Abulafia, Kabbalah. It's really fascinating.
Yes.
Just to Walter Hanegraaff's point that he made the other night at the round table, we all have the same brains, we all have the same bodies basically, and we all need oxygen. And when you deprive your brain of oxygen, the results are really instantaneous. Yeah. And how you systematically deprive your brain of oxygen, it's going to clearly have. Yeah. It's going to have cross-cultural reality because we're cross-cultural. Right. We're cross-cultural apes.
Yes. Yeah, I think a lot of academic work is trying to create distinctions and hold distinctions, importantly so, between cultures, but I think there's sort of a new, and I think rightfully so, as you're saying, a new trend in academia to point out that there is something shared amongst those cultures, which is the human organism. And although we may conceptualize it in very radically different ways, it still fundamentally is organically the same matter that we're dealing with, and therefore doing things with our breath would have the same, or would have comparable effects, let's say, whether you're doing that in the Far East or in the Near West or down south, wherever it is.
Yeah, like same as getting drunk. Basically, every culture develops some form of intoxication. Unsurprisingly, alcohol seems to affect everyone the same, basically everywhere, or whatever. Lots of different forms of intoxication. And I think that depriving the brain of oxygen is just another type of intoxication.
Oh, yeah, I mean, try to hold your breath for a while and see.
You feel weird.
Yeah.
Like I think that it's just again focusing on the power of intoxication.
This is a question from Flights Coup. I think I'm reading it right. Can you talk about the differences between Zen Buddhism and Daoism?
I can't.
You can't?
I can't.
No. I think you're the expert here.
Yeah, I've studied Buddhism for a long time, even though my specialism is more Indian and Tibetan Buddhism. But Taoism and Zen Buddhism, I would say they are pretty different. They are two different religions. And Zen Buddhism what's Zen Buddhism, right? Not Chan.
Zen Buddhism.
Okay, then Zen Buddhism is Japanese. Chan Buddhism is Chinese and incorporates some elements of Taoism, but it's still not quite the same as Taoism. And Zen Buddhism is also quite different from Chan Buddhism. So they are just very different religions, to be honest. There have been some influences. It's a bit like with Vajrayana Buddhism, which is the tantric form of Buddhism that has some influences from Tantra, from the Indian tradition, but it's still Tantric Buddhism is not the same as Tantra. They are quite different. In Buddhism, you have all the basic elements of the Four Noble Truths and the aim of the Nirvana as something that you want to achieve, and it's not something that you really find in Taoism. So they are very different systems, I'd say.
What would you say is it's funny, I feel like now I'm moderating the panel.
The comparisons probably is more feasible between Chan Buddhism and Daoism rather than Zen Buddhism, because Zen Buddhism is Japanese.
What would you say are the main differences that stick out to you between the two? Besides for them being entirely different systems.
Yeah, I think that you cannot really compare like Zen Buddhism and Taoism because they are culturally very, very different. So
how about Chan Buddhism then? What would be the? Because I did my video on Chan/Zen. I did distinguish between them in the video, but I discussed the fact that certain aspects of Chan Buddhism seem to be at least somewhat influenced by Daoism. And correct me if I'm wrong, but for example, there seems to be this emphasis in Chan Buddhism, not necessarily on nirvana in the sense of like escaping or transcending the world, but of sort of living in the world in a sort of virtuous, with virtuosity, or with spontaneity. And that seems to me rather similar to certain Taoist ideas like Wu Wei and so on. Would you agree?
Yeah, there are similarities, although I still see them as a bit different, a bit like when you look at Advaita Vedanta and Buddhism. I think for a long time I really struggled to see a difference between Advaita Vedanta and Buddhism because it seems like at the end of the day, they both really argue that everything is, that there's a non-dualist perspective, a very radical non-dualist perspective, because in Buddhism you have the idea that nothing exists in isolation, that everything appears into existence there's the concept in Sanskrit, the pratitya samutpada, the co-dependent arising. So there's nothing that appears into existence in an independent, solid and permanent state. So to me that always seemed very close to the idea of Advaita Vedanta. But then I think that probably the soteriological element is different in Advaita Vedanta and in Buddhism.
Sure.
Did Taoism ever get a foothold much in Japan?
Not that I'm aware of.
It's interesting. It's interesting what did, and like, I'd be curious. I was wondering if it didn't get a foothold, why, and why did Zen get its foothold? Like, to what is it, or is that somehow about similarity to the indigenous religion and
I think
Shinto?
so. I think Zen Buddhism incorporated aspects of Shinto. Whether that was an already existing tradition at that point is hard to say, but the indigenous religious tradition of Japan became incorporated into Buddhism. So I argue in one of my earlier videos that they've become essentially indistinguishable from each other for a couple of hundred years.
Something similar happened with Ben in Tibet and Buddhism. That they influenced each other, and I remember that my professor of Tibetan used to say that if you go in Tibet, it's very difficult to distinguish a Buddhist sacred place from a Bon sacred place.
That's very interesting.
Christianity had that effect in Europe too. I mean, Christianity was a bit more triumphalist in terms of, you can always tell where the old pagan shrines were.
Yeah,
that's
where the churches
are. Where the churches are now. Like you can tell where the capital of Tenochtitlan was, because that's where they tore everything down and built a church out of it. So it's like it's sort of the assimilation, and you'll go up to Uppsala and the big church there where they tore everything down and built the shrine. So
I think Daoism made its way somewhat into Korea, more so than Japan, but this is not my field of expertise. But I don't find a lot in Japan.
And also why east and not west? I mean, aside from the fact there's a mountain, I mean that it makes a big deal of it. But it's interesting how like something like a mountain can determine which way religion goes.
Yeah,
like the geography plays a decisive role in how religions travel. And like Silk Road, like you guys have seen this recently. They found those little statues of Buddha in Egypt.
No,
I didn't see that.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite things is actually here, religious studies wise, is actually here in Sweden, but in Stockholm in the museum. They have that exploded grave of a Viking chieftain, and sort of you walk into the grave, and it sort of like shows you all the things in space around his body. And one of the things he had was a little statue of the Buddha. Wow. That probably it's like lapis lazuli. They came from Afghanistan. That's wild. So he had tons of Islamic coins for silver, and like he had this little Buddha, and you're like, what in the world was a Viking chieftain doing with a little Buddha statue. It's just like, this shows you how far things can travel in the ancient world. But if physical objects can travel that far, certainly ideas can.
Yes.
We often imagine the ancient people back in the day as being completely shut off from each other. But that's really not true at all.
Yeah. And so there's always a speculation to what degree did, the gymnosophists, so-called gymnosophists, were able to get their ideas over across the Spice Road or whatever, like to what Alexander's armies press into Afghanistan, and you get this Gandharan art that's like this beautiful mixture of Indian and classical Greek art. Like, well, how much was also, because we know that Buddhist missionaries were being sent and did arrive in Egypt. They were actively Buddhist missionaries out there competing with Manichaeans and stuff.
It's fascinating.
It's fascinating. It's a great movie. It's a great movie made about that, like where you just get a mix of like the Manichaean guy and the Buddhist guy are like having a debate about.
Really?
I mean, it's such a cool scene for a movie.
There isn't a movie?
There is a movie. No, I don't know one.
No, I thought you said there was.
No, there is. No, there's a movie.
I need to see this movie.
Yeah, I would love to see that because it'd just be the most interesting.
You have to make it.
You have to make it. Yeah, we got to get into filmmaking industry.
I know.
We have some fun questions here, both some technical ones and some more sort of broader, abstract ones. There's someone hit a question. The username is a string of letters. So I'm not going to try and read it. Is the Virgin Mary story a translation mistake from the Old Testament into Greek? And then there's some more broader questions if these questions are too technical.
Like the idea that she was a virgin?
Yeah, the Parthenaeus problem. Because Isaiah 7:14 says that she was an Alma, not a Betula. Right. I think it's a translation mistake. But I think it's one the rabbis made. I think that whoever translated on purpose. They knew that word. They mistranslated on purpose.
Yeah. Do you want to give some context there, maybe?
So in the verse in Isaiah says that, and a young woman will conceive a child, Alma, which the word Alma can have all kinds of valences, but it can even have valences of professional non-virgin. It even mean sex worker. So it can have a range of valences, but there's a distinct word in Hebrew for virgin, Betula. And the Hebrew is not Betula, but when they translate it to Greek, they translate it as Parthenaeus. Parthenaeus definitely means virgin. And so the question is, why did very Jewish scholars elect not to translate? And I think in Onkelos too, it's just translated over as, Onkelos is the Aramaic translation of the Hebrew Bible. It also just renders it as young woman. Same.
Yeah. It seems to me like the author of Matthew is intentionally translating it there as virgin,
right? Because
at the end of the verse, which is and he's named, and the child's name should be called Emmanuel, God with us. And so it's the end of the verse which is informing the way that he reads the verse.
And it's funny because Matthew's gospel is the most Jewish gospel,
right?
And yet he leans so heavily on the Greek translation, which is a very Jewish translation. The Septuagint is a Jewish book, but it's an interesting moment where this very Aramaic sounding, thinking writer leans Greek because he needs the birth miracle. Really, he really needs to get off the ground.
Yeah.
But I don't know if it's a mistranslation, but it is. There's some there, and it isn't straightforwardly. The word Betula is not in that sentence.
Right. So to answer the question, I would say that it's not a mistake; it's an intentional mistranslation.
Yeah, that's what I've always considered.
I don't feel informed enough to have an opinion, but I trust these two.
But I will say that so much of world history has turned on that.
Here's a broader question:
creative translation
beyond just the biblical scholarship. This is from Leonardo Capstick. With the so-called new atheist movement dying out, do you think, and the scare quotes are there in the question, do you think public discourse about religion will improve?
What does it mean?
Is it dying out?
With the so-called new atheist movement dying out, do you think public
What's the
discourse...
new atheist movement?
New atheists,
like Dawkins and Hitchens.
Sam Harris.
Sam Harris.
And is it dying out?
I don't know. That's the first time I've heard.
Can we question the question, or do we accept the premise of the question?
I think it is dying. I think that they don't control. I don't think they have hegemony on that conversation anymore.
That's different from dying out. It's more losing the hegemony over the public conversation.
Right, but I think that aside from the dark corners of Reddit, where the new atheism is pretty popular, I think that people are definitely ready for a more nuanced conversation about religion, and they realize that even atheism isn't actually
a religion.
Well, I would say even if there's a lot of nuances to non-theism.
Sure.
And militant evangelical non-theism is actually just one vocal, frankly irritating camp. But I think there's lots of non-theisms out there. Like, I'm a non-theist. Like, I'm pretty interested in having very subtle conversations about, like, for instance, mysticism, mystical experiences, which I think are totally available to non-theists. And so I think that the public is very eager to have conversations around religion that are a lot more subtle than evolution's true, God's dead. Like that, it's like, you know, 16-year-old Nietzscheans. We could use a lot less of those in the world.
Right. So let's take the question as if that movement is dying out, will that improve the discourse about religion?
I think hopefully, because my opinion has always been that the kind of new atheist position is often based on a very shallow understanding of religion to begin with.
Yeah.
And if it's sort of dying out, or if they're losing hegemony over the conversation, maybe that's a result of people being, or at least wanting to be more informed, having more nuanced discussions on religion. And that's, in that case, I definitely think it's a sign that things are getting
also look it up.
better. Right.
Like, we're proof of that, right? Like, if this is between all of us sitting here, we have
different beliefs.
We have different beliefs, but also we have almost 1 million subscribers, right? Like, people are interested in having deeper conversations about religion, and I think that Richard Dawkins' level, right? Like, yeah, they may be good on the science, but they're really bad on the religion. And I think that having more deeper, more sophisticated conversations on these topics, I think the fact that our channels are successful in the way that they are, to me, a good evidence that the debate is, that people's interest is shifting and they want more subtlety about it.
I would add that it's the, let's say, the dying hegemony of new atheism, but also the end of the hegemony of religion. Both of those sides need to come down for a nuanced conversation to emerge. And I think that people in a more, at least in parts of the world, that are more liberated from oppressive forms of religion, now have the freedom to turn back to religion on their own terms, to ask of it their own existential questions. And that's something certainly that I've seen in my own milieu, my own friend groups. I missed a fun question here from earlier. Did you want to add something to that, Angela?
Oh, I agree with you guys. I think that it's important to have a nuanced conversation. I think that people now are also ready for that. I think there was a time when people believed that we were going towards a secularized age, and more and more people would become atheist or non-religious. But I think that even the turn that Peter Berger, the sociologist of religion, had turned against his own initial idea about the secularization theory, then he moved on from that and he said, well, actually, we don't live in a secular age, we live in a pluralist age, where you have multiple layers of beliefs within families and even within one person. So I think that also the idea of religion that we have has changed. I think that what people thought of as religion was something that was heavily Christian or Abrahamic based. And now it tends to be a bit more nuanced and complex. That's why a lot of people that do not abide by the three main monotheisms used to say, I'm spiritual, I'm not religious. And there are scholars that have studied the so-called nuns, which are the non-religious. And it turns out that they are actually very religious indeed. It's just that the way they classify religion is an institutionalized form of religion that resembles especially Christianity, but also Islam and Judaism. So they see that as a structure that they don't identify with, because usually people that identify as spiritual want a more eclectic, individually tailored approach to religiosity. But it is still religion, it's just that they didn't call it religion because of that bias of what they thought of as religion.
We had a follow-up question here, which, again, another sort of big question. Is religion important?
Yes.
Yes. It's important. It's important as a subject of study, because it is important to people around the world, which means it's important for us to understand it, understand how people relate to it, and what relationship people have to it.
Let's talk religion.
Yes, that's the whole point of the title.
I mean, I would say not only is it important just as a fact, but I would say it's important as a discourse, because unlike philosophy, which operates ideally as an interrogative discourse that asks questions, I think what makes religion so frighteningly powerful is that it's a discourse of absolute belief, of absolutes, and that those people who that can speak on behalf of the gods, they have enormous social power. So I think that in that way, being able to interrogate religion is an incredibly important human right.
Yes.
Thinking about human rights discourse and interrogating religion, I think that's freedom to religion and also freedom from religion, but also freedom to interrogate religion is an incredibly important part of what it means to be a free person.
I think that it's just the question about religion is just unavoidable, because I would argue that every person has religious beliefs, even the atheists and even the agnostics. I mean, it is still a religious stance. If you say, I don't believe in God, or I suspend my judgment about God, the gods, the divine, the metaphysical world, that is still a religious stance. And that is still affecting the way you live in society, the way you live your life, the way you interact with people. So I think that religion is very, very important to understand everything about human society, history, sociology, how we relate to society. It just permeates everything.
Yeah. I have a question for you, Angela, but for everyone, but maybe you first. And this is from, I'll find the name in a second because it's jumping around. From Ahmed Shayo. Is there a difference between paganism and Satanism?
No.
Hey! Don't ruin my job! Yes, there is a difference between paganism and Satanism. And when I talk about paganism, now I'm currently co-editing a volume for Equinox on pagan religions in 5 minutes, which is part of a series of Religion in 5 minutes. And Susan Owen and I are curating the pagan religion side. And that's one of the questions, because it's one of the most asked questions. So when I talk about paganism, I talk about contemporary paganism, the capitalized paganism, because paganism from the ancient world, scholars don't capitalize it. So the way we distinguish between the two is not capitalizing the ancient form of paganism and capitalizing contemporary paganism. Whereas in the past, there used to be the term neo-paganism, which scholars are now not using anymore. We prefer contemporary paganism. But anyway, no, it's not the same as Satanism, because contemporary paganism is a new religious movement that has certain main traits. It tends to be very nature-based. It tends to worship in line with the cycles of nature. And it doesn't really employ Christian or Abrahamic worldviews because it's pagan. So paganism has its own worldview and its own way of conceptualizing deities. And Satanism is very much rooted in Christianity. And you could argue maybe in an Abrahamic religious system, but I think the Satanism is very much linked to Christianity. In the way it is conceived, and the idea of Satan is formed, because in the Hebrew Bible, Satan is not really we can understand it now in the public discourse when we talk about Satanism, something that's quite different and has developed in a certain way via the Christian discourse. So no, I would say that paganism is not, and I repeat, is not the same as Satanism, because pagans say, we don't even believe in Satan, we don't believe in the Christian mythology, so how could we worship Satan, how could we worship the devil? So that's not really what pagans do. I could make things more complicated, but it's better that I don't.
Yeah, that was a great answer.
Yeah, I think that, it's just like simply put, it's hard for pagans to be Satanists if there's no Satan in their paganism.
Yes. Yeah. How can you be a Satan if you're not?
There's no Venn diagram.
Yeah, if you don't endorse the Christian view, and also the way pagans see the divine and deities is completely different from Christianity. You don't have the arch enemy or the pure evil. pagan gods and pagan deities are all good and evil according to the way we say good and evil. I don't think that pagans believe in good and evil anyway in such demarcated, ontologically moral ways. So it's not something that can be so easily defined. Pagans tend to believe in an ethics based on individual responsibility. Then it also depends on the type of pagan, because like in Wicca you have threefold law, which means that everything that you do, good or bad, which we could, better words might be beneficial or harmful, anything that you do comes back to you 3 times fold. That's one part of the Wiccan read, but this is something that the Wiccans believe, whereas other types of pagans don't abide by that, and they just say that they believe in an ethics that is based on individual responsibility. You don't have gods, deities that will send you to a place or another depending on the actions that you take. So it's all based on individual responsibility. And you may ask, so how is the individual responsibility assessed? Many pagans believe in our animists or pantheists. They believe that the divine is imbued in everything, and many also believe in a sense of interconnectedness of things. So usually there is a sense that, like probably many people as well, the idea that you want to do good to others in terms of being beneficial and creative, because you are adding to the interconnected web that you're part of. You are acting, you are contributing in a creative way and not in a destructive way. So it's more a sense of, I'm part of this interconnected web. The more benefit and the more creative energy I can input into this web, the better. Because it's not a sense that somebody is going to punish me if I don't. It's more a sense that I feel that I'm similar to you. I feel that I'm similar to a plant, to a chair, to everything. So that contributes to how you assess ethically what to do and what not. Although it's very complex, because of course pagans also accept the idea that destruction is also part of nature, and so that should also be embraced. So it's actually a very complex discussion, but I hope that gives a succinct overview.
So. Why do you think some people would even equate Satanism and paganism to begin with?
I think that's because for a long time, pagan has been used as non-Christian or the religions that I'm part of. I think that also in Islam and Judaism, right? You have the idea of pagan as non-Jew.
Right.
It's not a phrase we use, and it's not a phrase. It's not. We don't. There's no word in Hebrew pagan.
Okay.
Like there's other words for outsiders, but there's no. It was invented by Christians, and it was even used by ancient pagans to describe people in the countryside. It just means like people in the countryside, right?
Yeah, it means pagan comes from paganus, pagana, which is inhabitant or dweller of the pagus. The pagus is a rural place, basically. So it's it was a term that was a derogatory term to call people that lived in rural places and were, so ignorant or backwardly that they wouldn't convert to Christianity. So it is, I think, a heavily Christian. It has a heavily Christian connotation in that sense. So I think that's why, viewed from a Christian lens, people would equate paganism to Satanism, because it's the evil, it's what is not Christian. And if you're not Christian, then you must be evil. So equals Satan.
Which is interesting because they had a special word for it. Like, they could have just called them Satanists, but they didn't. Like, clearly, just because you're ignorant rural person, doesn't mean you're...
I don't think that at the time they had the concept of Satanism.
I think when the term pagan came out, I think even so-called pagans used it too. I think I've read that elite Roman writers would often describe people who lived in the countryside as paganos. And Christians adopted that language because they're not speaking Latin originally. They're the technical language that develops in the Greek world is areos. They're heretics. They believe they have incorrect opinions. But I think it develops later in the Roman West. I think Roman writers even used it of other Romans. Bumpkin is maybe a translation of it.
I don't know, because in terms of the scholarly work that I've read, it seems that the first occurrences are from Christian authors.
Augustine?
I can't remember what's the first one.
Maybe it's like Tertullian or something.
Could be,
Because the same term is not used in Greek. They don't have a term like that. Like they
We have like a equivalent term.
I think they tend to talk about. I mean, heresy is early picked up in the Greek word, like Origen and people like that use that language. But I don't think there's an equivalent. Like in Islam, there's like a nice, convenient word for people who don't convert. So I don't think a word like that ever. There's never a really clear vocabulary in early Christianity. Because the closest term to something like that as a slur in Judaism is like avodah zarah, like foreign worship. But there's no no term for someone who does avodah zarah, is there?
Well, you would just call them a oved avodah zarah, someone who serves worship, or someone who is oved kochavim lazanot.
Yeah, star worship.
Constellations.
Right. Yeah, that's in the legal text. It's like avodah kochavim, like people who worship stars. But
in Islam, you have mushrikun, basically, so polytheists, or more literally like associators. Would be like the closest, I think.
But even the term like avodah zarah typically describes things that Jews aren't allowed to do. Not necessarily. There's a kind of concern that if you're on some other team, you're on some other team. You should do whatever you want, or you should do whatever. But there's a sense of like, if you're a Jew, you can't do certain kinds of things. You can't appear like them.
To a greater extent. So.
Yeah, it's much more concerned about what Jews do and don't do, as opposed to like what Christians or Persians or Zoroastrians did.
Should we try to do like a lightning round of questions? Because we have a lot of wonderful questions that just keep
speed dating
rolling through.
Okay.
Go.
Okay. Have you ever delved into a topic and be amazed by how much you've learned?
Yes.
Yes, but more so how much I don't know.
Yes.
Yes. That's great. Thoughts on free will? Do we have free will, or is everything determined?
Yes.
Yes to what?
Yes.
I think that the concept of free will is very Christian. So the idea of free will is a Christian concept. I would see more as what amount of agency do we have? I would reframe it that way, because I think that having free will or not having free will is a very Christian question. I'm
a determinist. Yeah, I'm like a hyper-determinist even. So no free will.
I'm not surprised.
Yeah. No, I'm a Spinozist.
So I think I'm not a determinist, but I think that
compatibilist. I think we call you all.
What?
Compatibilist is what
I would be something like a compatibilist, but I wouldn't be able to formulate in what way. But I think.
So no, for me it's more a matter of what degree of agency I have, because so in a way I'm sort of determinist, but to a degree. So I think there are some things that we are determined by and others that we have control over. And the amount of agency that you can have, the extent of agency that you can have, varies depending on multiple factors, maybe including magic. If you believe
Philip and
that.
I were chatting about this in the car yesterday, yes. And there was a quote which I brought up from David Lloyd, a great scholar, who wrote a book on Buddhist and Hindu comparative study of non-duality between the two, and he writes that if we're to take so let's say non-dualistic position, which is the topic we study, then ultimate determinism and ultimate free will coincide in that moment. And I found that to be a persuasive position.
I guess I should also say, even though I'm a pretty hyper-determinist, I'm also kind of Kantian about this and say that free will as a regulative ideal was necessary for ethics, and therefore that I would say that free will functions as a regulative ideal a la Kant, but it is regulative and ideal. It's really important to.
Right.
But actually, like if I'm like just going in at straight first order metaphysics, no, it's immediately free will. Or physics for that matter. Physics also now seems to be clearly indicating it's not.
Question from Colin Gallagher. How are you guys?
I'm doing good. I'm happy to be hanging out with wonderful friends.
Likewise, for the first time we will meet in person.
Nice.
Yeah, I think it's like I'm sort of in that part of my journey. Actually, that's like a big word. I'm like in this in this lifetime.
Yes, you're sounding like a mystic.
Yeah, mystic. No, like I mean, just like in my time in Europe, where like I'm hitting that first major wave of homesick. I'm like, I'm feeling that, but also it's just like, especially for those of us who've been traveling, we've really been doing like a ton. Like I've been in how many countries now for some period of time? Like at least 4 in the past like 7 days. So it's good, but like good that you can. I'm glad to see the light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah. You were in 4 countries just yesterday.
Yeah.
So,
are you getting back on Wednesday to the US?
I'm flying back to Amsterdam for Wednesday. I'll be there.
So you're staying in Amsterdam?
I'm staying for one night in Amsterdam just to like have a night to myself and like walk the streets. And because I also Schiphol is such a nightmare that I did not want to get there the same day I was flying. Schiphol's a real nightmare.
Garta Berna, and I apologize for mispronouncing that, asks who is the most important political theologist?
Political theologist.
oh wow,
No, this is like a
important.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't specify if it's contemporary or like historical.
The entire question.
like. Well, we're talking about political theology, or we're talking like what? I guess like, it depends on how those adjectives and nouns are functioning. Because there's a political theology, which is like that's a whole domain of philosophy. There's important philosophers in that who aren't. I mean, Augustine probably.
That's the name that came up in my head too.
Yeah, Augustine did more to shape the tenor of things like just war theory and what makes a legitimate sovereign. And there's basically no political Western theological politics outside of Augustine. It's a super intimidating work, but if you've never read De Cavit Today, it's probably on the City of God. The City of God's there's also important stuff in magic in there as well. It's worth reading for that if you just want to do the magic stuff. But I would say that in many ways, like Western civilization, Western Latin civilization is basically a dialogue with that book in a huge way.
Let's see if we can get a short answer on this. Samir Karki says, is Satan better than Jesus?
Satan better than Jesus.
I don't like Satan.
Wow.
It's better that I don't talk about this. I don't know why
Feel free to abstain.
No answer that you. I mean, I'm not a particular fan of either, frankly.
I don't know why, but your question reminded me of something that I read on an Italian wall that says, Jesus loves you, but Satan can do that thing with his tongue.
No.
I hope you're not getting in trouble.
There's always these great Jesus can do this, but so and so can do this.
Yeah, that's it.
Like Jesus saves, but Moses invests.
Moses invests.
There's like a little bit of anti-Semitism in there. Nice.
I like Jesus better. That's my answer.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of either.
I don't have a preference.
You're leaving yourself out of these questions, Debbie. So
I'm in a good position.
I see you over there. You can't moderate yourself out of these questions, brother.
Here's I don't know if I fully understand this question, but if you guys do you feel that modern psychology has a line to esoteric/mystic thought, or is the apparent need for scientific ideas to have a definable and discrete categorization an irreconcilable difference?
Two very different questions. The first question is definitely yes. There's no modern esotericism without Jung.
True.
Just like period. Or not just Jung, but also like Freud too. Like Aleister Crowley in the Goetia, his version of the Goetia, even says things like the goetic demons are just regions of the human brain. So like he was even that early in the early 20th century was very clearly and heavily. Now Crowley changed his mind about that. He began to believe in the independent existence of these entities toward the later part of his life. But there's no esotericism, Western modern esotericism without psychology.
I also have a video on the Crowley and the psychologizing of entities. But yeah, I agree. I think that psychology definitely changed the game of esotericism and how it was conceptualized, and also opened the floor for the so-called soft polytheism. And I also have a video on that, the difference between hard polytheism and soft polytheism on my channel. And the idea is that in hard polytheism, people think that there are different entities that are ontologically existent and independent from us. Whereas soft polytheism is more the idea that gods exist in relation to us in certain way. Like, for instance, there could be archetypes, like Eros could be the archetype of passion within ourselves, or they could be seen as forces of nature. So it's a way of seeing the deities that is considered soft, because they are not ontologically real in and of themselves, but they are real in relation to certain aspects of us, which are usually heavily psychologized. And I think that there are also some atheist witches that adopt forms of soft polytheism, and they argue that that is a form of atheism, which is also interesting. Others don't see that as a form of atheism; they just see that as another type of polytheism.
Also, I would say it's not just esotericism, but like modern religion. Like, there's no existentialism, there's no like neo-Hasidism also. It's downstream of this shift. It's just people can say what they want to about psychoanalysis, but there is no modernity without it. No contemporary intellectual world without it. It had such an impact. For better or for worse.
Thoughts on perennialism? That's a question.
We had a whole discussion about this like a year ago.
Yeah, we did. We did a whole lecture.
There are perennialist scholars that I definitely admire.
I'm definitely a no on perennialism.
I think that perennialism can be a viable spiritual tool for people who believe in that, but academically speaking, that would be terrible, because a perennialist view adopted as an academic, I think that it would go outside of a rigorous methodology that leads to accurate knowledge.
Also, I think it's like a function of like this weird thing. I don't give you look out these comments too on your channel, but there's a tendency of the human mind to assume that because two things can be compared, they must be connected.
Right.
Yes.
I sometimes call it comparamania. That like if two things can be compared, they must be connected. And the idea is that things can. Comparativa is not a grounds for any ontological connection whatsoever. But like, oh, this god's associated with lightning, and this god's associated with lightning, so they must be the same god. No, it's not. That doesn't logically follow. And it certainly doesn't historically follow.
We have some super chats, which we can pull up here as well.
Thank you.
Oh, super chats, thank you.
Yes. Smashing Paper Tigers
Good name.
asks, do you think contemporary pagan religions will become more organized, in parentheses, communities, places of worship, legal recognition, etc., over the next 50 years? Question mark.
I'm guessing that's a question for me.
Sounds like it is.
So it depends what you mean by organized. In terms of having more places of worship, even though pagans would, I don't think they would use the term worship, but sacred places to practice, yes, and I think that's happening already. Even in Italy, for instance, there's the goddess temple in Rome, and there are very few temples, pagan temples or pagan sacred places in Italy, but they are not institutionalized because there isn't a central dogma or a central authority in paganism. And in terms of whether that will change, whether paganism will become more institutionalized like other types of religions that are more dogmatic and more institutionalized, I don't think so. And at least I can use the case study both Finland and Italy, because in both places, at least, I'm sure that it probably happened in other countries too, but in both these countries, what happened is that in order to get legal recognition as a religion, there was they formed a group to do that. But in Italy, and the same happened in Finland, there's a paper by Timo Taira on that, if you want to look that up. It's a peer-reviewed paper, which when I read it, it's like, oh, the same thing happened in Italy. And what happened is that since to be recognized as religion in Italy, you need to resemble Christianity, basically. There was a massive fight within the pagan community, and they said, no, we are not doing this. We'd rather not classify as a religion than just alter the very nature of paganism. So there were very few that were trying to do that, and they were accused of wanting to become the popes of paganism. So that didn't go down well. And
great band name. Great band name, Popes of Paganism.
So I think that paganism is very resistant to institutionalization, and I think that many pagans are anti-dogma and anti that kind of structure. So I don't think that is going to happen. What might happen more is the fact that different traditions within paganism might become more organized, but at least I don't see anytime soon paganism becoming more institutionalized in that sense. And if it gets recognized as a religion, which in a way it did, the British Druid Order got the charity recognition as a religion, but you need to have a country that has a view of what constitutes as a religion that doesn't resemble Abrahamic religions. You don't like that term, I'm sorry. How can I call it? The three monotheistic religions.
This is also why governments need to have religious studies people working for them, because otherwise they're going to make really bad, stupid policy decisions and really discriminate against people.
So what I see more happening is probably governments and the public discourse around religion changing to the point where a religion like paganism, which is very different from Abrahamic religions, can be seen as a religion, and it doesn't have to change its very nature to be recognized as such. And also, since pagans are generally quite anti-dogmatic, I don't think that they care as much about the label. They care more about what they believe in and the practices and the fact that they remain, the way they are with that kind of mindset.
Does Italy recognize Hinduism?
I don't think that Italy recognizes Islam. I think that I think doesn't recognize Islam as a religion. I think the problem was also the same, that it doesn't resemble that, because the law around recognizing a religion was, I think it still dates the fascist era, so it won't surprise anyone.
Surprise.
Yes.
I mean, Islam is relatively similar in structure.
It is present in Italy as well, but as far as I know, I think that at the time when this whole pagan thing happened in Italy was 2007, 2008, and I remember that there was a whole conversation about the fact that not even Islam was recognized as a religion, and there was a whole conversation in the pagan community about that, and the fact that the problem was more than the law had to change rather than the pagans had to abide by those standards. And that was the winning argument was this one, was that we shouldn't try to seek religious status since things are like this now. We should try and change what the government considers to be a religion. And that will benefit not only pagans but also Muslims and other people. So that was the winning argument within the pagan community.
It's so interesting that it still happens today, because I'm reminded of Sikhism under British colonial rule, which, if you wanted protection as a group or as a religious group, you needed to be seen as a religion. And so the Sikhs, at least this is what a lot of historical scholarship says, we're also somewhat forced to shape their religion according to like a Christian or Abrahamic framework in order to be seen as a religion of its own, to get the kind of protection from the government.
I think that now that I think about it, Buddhism got the recognition because they created an organization. Don't quote me on that because I can't remember the details off the top of my head, but if I remember correctly, they created like an organization called the Buddhist Italian something, and so the association got the recognition. But I think that the process was that you had to create a sort of organization in order to get a legal recognition, which is strange. I think that the law should change about.
I think any laws written during the fascist period should be reevaluated. Like, as an idea, it's like, fascists weren't so great at making fair laws, in my understanding of what they were up to.
It's my impression as well.
It's everybody's impression, at least through here.
Yeah. Philip, have there been any? Do you know of any successful attempts to rebuild any sort of the old Norse temples here in Sweden and at Uppsala? Or seems like, since the Christians tore down their temples and put churches there, it seems like the pagans should be able to throw a temple up next door at least.
I don't know of any temples, but there are definitely like smaller shrines that are put up. And I know in Stockholm and Uppsala, for example, and there are groups that are holding like Blut ceremonies. I'm not sure about their like legal status actually. Now that you ask,
because I know that Wiccans at least got recognition by the. I remember in my lifetime in the U.S. but like in the military, where they could get. I think one of the guests that was on your show recently was really responsible for that, where they were able to get pagan Wiccan imagery on their tombstones for veterans. And I've been to a graveyard, a veteran graveyard, where I saw a couple of those, and it was like a very like for a person who, for me, cares about freedom of religion. Seeing that,
yeah, that's nice.
Was like, okay, look, good. That's like at least like, people can rest under symbols that serve their country. They should be recognized.
Yeah.
We have another super chat here from Louis Jorge, and it's their first super chat. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
For the four, any interest in Mesoamerican folk religion?
Sure. Definitely. I don't know much about it, but I've been looking into making some content about that, which is a great excuse for me to learn new things. I would love to cover the Aztec religion, for example. I know Andrew already did one on
Andrew
that.
Henry from Religion for Breakfast made a video on the Aztec religion.
He also made one on the Maya religion, and they're both great, so if you're interested, you should definitely check those out.
I've done one on Maya. Mysticism related to bloodletting.
Yeah.
One of my favorite names of all time is, you could be named something like Jaguar Shield, Heavily Scarred Foreskin. Like you can earn the title of Heavily Scarred Foreskin. I'm like, man, it's like some cultures just like
that's metal.
Metal, just like pure metal.
There's a friend of mine who's done a PhD on Maya archaeology, so I always think that I should invite her over on my channel. That would be interesting. But yeah, it's something that I'd like to cover as well.
Yeah, the role of Venus in those cultures, especially Mayan cultures, like astrology and astronomy and their religious cycles, like it's really impressive to go down to to Chichen Itza and like see the first observatories built in the New World for like tracking the path of Venus, and just like they had a whole calendar just around Venus transits. It's really, really amazing stuff. It's really.
And they had a the Aztecs too. They had a developed deep like theology and philosophy.
There's a great book out about Aztec philosophy, actually written by a scholar of Spinoza, who started studying it and really like reframes Aztec theories of time and space and motion, and really puts them in like Western philosophical categories in a way it was really nice, because it allowed Western philosophers access to some really important indigenous wisdom. It's a great book. It's worth reading.
I look forward to more research being done on that topic, because I think there's a lot to explore there.
It's really important that we do that, because otherwise the default image of the Aztecs, especially the Aztecs, is a conquistador image of just like bloody sacrifices. It's funny that often us Western people, European people, will think of them as like, oh, the Aztecs, they're just like sacrificing people every day, and we like literally don't see Cortez murdering the entire population. Like we were walking around the churches, right, in Amsterdam. Like one of the things that like boils my blood is like listening to Europeans just like, oh, Muslims, they just tear things down and they can't stand, they break all these shrines and things like this. And I walked past a church just destroyed by Protestants in the 17th century. And I'm like,
iconoclasm.
Yeah, you guys have done your share of iconoclasm. I don't want to hear anybody. You guys go to pointing fingers. It's going to get real uncomfortable really fast.
Yeah. It's like throwing stones in stained glass houses.
It's literally that.
We have a super chat from Ziktomov, who says, "Thank you. This panel has not much of a question, but a gratitude. Thank you. This panel has absolutely changed how I see the world."
Oh wow! Thank you. That's lovely.
I hope that's good.
I mean, it could have changed in any direction.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, if you're gonna spend the next days crying in the shower, I don't know who I am anymore.
Yeah, thanks. You always video destroyed my faith in God. Oh crap! Sorry. Oh, no. I hope not. I hope for the positive.
Yeah, considering that he super chatted that, I guess that he considers that a good thing.
We have a question here from Al-Ram. Thoughts on eschatology itself and its effects on religious societies. Do you think they might be true predictions, or do they represent different ideas?
It's a theological question.
Yeah, I don't know if I can answer that.
Well, we can answer the first, the sociological. Do eschatologies affect religious societies? Sure.
Yeah.
And maybe how so?
I think one of the things, I guess I can speak to about Judaism, and it'd be interesting to hear what you think, Zevi, too. It's like one of the things I love about Judaism is its relative lack of eschatology. Mm-hmm. Like there's that great line in Tractate Chagiga, like it's better to not speculate. Those people who speculate about the end of the world, it's better they not come into the world. Mm-hmm. There's something about like, don't worry about the end of the world. It's going to sort itself out. Like, the world's going to be fine. You sort your life out. And I think we talk about sort of apocalyptic religions. I mean, here I mean apocalyptic in the sense of focusing on eschatology, not apocalyptic in the strict sense. But that religious belief is among the more worrying beliefs to me, especially the idea that the world's about to imminently end, because it allows people to basically abdicate any responsibility for this world. I think there was an EPA guy during the the Reagan administration who was asked point blank, like, what are we going to do about the ozone layer or whatever? And he was like, well, do this, that, and the other, but the truth of the matter is that Jesus is coming back soon, and we have to worry about it. And I'm like, I don't want Jesus to take the wheel to be my political strategy for making the world better. So I worry about, especially like, and also people, the kind of moral things they'll do to like immanentize the eschaton, right? Like we can force the hand of God to come back by doing things. It's had a powerful effect in human history, I think, often for the negative.
Would you say that the same phenomenon can have the opposite effect too? That if the end is coming and you believe in an eschatology where you will be judged for your actions, might that not make people even more keen to, like, now I have to really
be good? Yeah, as long as they. Yeah, I think it allows them to. It certainly makes it's a compulsion to be pure and to purify, but that purity and purifying often comes at the price of things like the bonfire, the vanities of Savonarola, or like. It rarely works out into a live and let live attitude. Very rarely.
In paganism, you don't have much eschatology either. It's also very based on the present.
Ragnarok, at least from the Norse.
Yeah, you have that in heathenry.
Interesting question how that influences religious society?
I think society in general.
Society, yeah. Trying to think like the difference between a religious system like paganism versus like Christianity or Islam, which would be like the polar opposites in this case. Very much concerned with eschatology and not so much.
I would say Thelema is sort of an eschatological religion, like the new Aeon coming with Aeon of Horus and all that. I think that's to me that's true. I see very much Crowley's upbringing from his like hardcore Protestant days. This idea of like this, he's a kind of apocalyptic prophet, and there's like a new Aeon. It's not eschatological.
I'm not sure that I see that as apocalyptic though. I see it more as, I mean, even the New Age movement has something like that, you know, the New Age of Aquarius. So I see it more as a way of sort of brushing apart the past and sort of starting anew, rather than apocalypticism.
Well, I think that even in Christian apocalypticism, like the world, there's like 1,000. It doesn't really end. That's about the funny thing about the end of the world. It's not really the end. It's just the beginning of the end. It's sort of like the world gets sort of purified and perfected, and there's like on the other side of things, there's either heaven or the new earth or whatever. Is that often the end of the world is not the end of the world. It's just the transformation of the world in some important sense. Right. And that's true.
In that sense, then you do have that in paganism too.
So I think eschatology broadly can, like in things, like broadly speaking, the end of this world is what it's talking about.
Right. End of the world as we know it.
Right. And that's certainly true in Judaism.
If it is true about also the end of a cycle, without that sense of doom, impending doom, then I think that, although you have also the Kali Yuga, for instance, in the Hindu tradition. So there is eschatology in pagan religions.
It's true of Ragnarok too, because that's like the end of the world, but it's also a rebirth.
Right, Baldur's son or whatever survives. But he's the only one, right? So like the only person that survives.
He's not mentioned by name, but someone's going to come. Right. That might though be a later.
I see that. I can see some Christian sticking that in there.
Yeah, but there seems to be the idea that after Ragnarok, there's a rebirth where everything sort of a beautiful world comes back. But it's a new world. That's the point. Right?
Yeah, I think we might need to speak up a little for the audience.
Okay.
I think there is this tension in Judaism, for sure, in Jewish mysticism, between the desire to imminent the eschaton, to sort of make the end of days now, to end that, and like what someone like Gershom Schalm calls the Jewish messianic mystics and others as living life in deferment, as if like this current moment is not good enough in history, and only when the new thing starts do things then get good. And I think, to what you were saying, Philip, it very much depends on what the image of that eschatology is. Like if it's one in which all heathens burn and we rule over our enemies, then trying to immanentize that vision might not be the best thing for society or what we'd like to see. But if the eschatological vision is one where the lamb shall lay with the lion, or a peaceful version essentially, then I think that the attempt to immanentize that might be a helpful one. And there may be some sort of despair that if this cycle or this reality is as it is, and nothing can change, nothing will ever change, and we're stuck under the powers that be, then why try to do anything? And I think that that impetus to bring the end, when the end is a positive one,
Ghosts.
can be helpful.
So the curtain closes on its own, apparently.
Yes.
We're trying to close the curtain on this stage of history.
Yeah,
to
so
move on to the next one.
Yeah.
Are they going to shut us down?
I don't know.
We're locked in. It's over.
I was also, we
This
also
is
came here.
our Ragnarok.
We kind of escaped here privately, and then the irony of privately live streaming to hundreds of people as it dawned upon me.
Right. Yeah, maybe it's Ragnarok. It's an appropriate country to be in for Ragnarok.
Yeah.
And this is like the most, like Uppsala was the most holy place for the Norse, right? It was like the biggest holy shrine. If I remember correctly.
It was a big one.
Right.
I don't know if it was necessarily the biggest one. I don't think the cult was that centralized. I think it was much more spread out and localized. But for sure, it's one of the important places.
I think Christian. I mean, I guess I'm also reading that from Christians who they really argued that, because they really worked hard to like de-paganify it. Like took some effort.
Yeah, was that one of the last places too?
I think it was the last to hold out.
Yeah.
I think the Christians really had a fight on their hands, because like the last of the Norse priests were also pretty willing to. Right. I mean, they're going to Valhalla. You go into Valhalla defending that place, you're going to really fight hard. I think the Christians had a really difficult time de-Christianifying, and they really made a big deal when they did. I mean, that big, nice church, that's...
Yeah. And then Uppsala became like the center for Christianity.
Yeah. It was like very, I think that was I think that part of that was really really about rooting it out from the core. It's unfortunate. Unfortunate. Everyone's had their trouble with the Christians.
Yes.
Including other Christians.
Exactly, yes.
Serious question here. Do you believe the gods made heavy metal?
Yes.
Only the gods. Not God. Just the gods.
Right.
And the devil.
Right.
He had a hand in that. Good stuff.
Do any of you know your zodiac?
Not really.
My zodiac.
Oh, my sign?
Zodiac sign.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, sure. I'm a Capricorn.
Aquarium.
I think I'm the same as you.
Yeah. We are both Aquarians. You can tell that.
Pisces.
Pisces?
Nice.
Oh, sweet.
I have no idea what any of that means.
Yeah, me neither. I have no. I like. It's really funny because I only know like really technical Hellenistic astrology. I know absolutely nothing about modern sun sign astrology. So it's I know next to nothing about what any of that's supposed to be.
Question for Dr. Puka. What's going on, current trends in European paganism?
In European paganism, current trends.
Current trends. What's hot on the market?
It sounds like a journal. Current trends in European paganism.
Yeah, that's
Published
true.
by Brill.
That's a good question. So, current trends. I think that there's been for a long time a trend towards eclecticism, and now pagans are moving more towards traditionalism or multi-traditionalism. And what other trends I can see? That people are not meeting in groups as much, especially younger generations. I actually gave an interview recently about that. And one of the reasons might be that younger generations are more used to interacting and finding their communities online. But it seemed like in the past there was more, even though there were probably fewer pagans, and my main frame of reference is Italy here, because that's where I do my field work, even though I've researched European paganism as well. But I think that, yeah, there's also a trend towards practicing more by yourself or having your community online, because that way you can find exactly the people that align with your worldview and that have maybe work with the same pantheon or with the same deities. Whereas when you go to pagan groups or pagan moods are usually the once a month meeting that pagans have. You will find that the other peoples, well, pagans are not that many. So in a city, you will find that there might be, 10 people, 20 people, and they all have a slightly different take on paganism and different practices. So it's a bit difficult to have a practice together. That's why, for instance, in Italy, one thing that happened was the pagan groups in Italy tended, and probably still tend, to have a more eclectic Wiccan-based approach, because that seems to be more inclusive, so that you have sort of the main things that you find in paganism in a Wiccan way, because I think the Wicca did a very good job at syncretizing many things and putting them together, like it did with the Wheel of the Year, for instance, and creating things in a new way that at the same time gives you a blueprint of paganism that you can shape however you like. There was a trend about having the eclectic type of paganism, so that it's a bit more inclusive and welcoming, and then everybody will obviously have their own specific tradition. But I think pagans are now moving more away from a wild eclecticism, and either try to be eclectic in a more systematic way, or being traditionalist or multi-traditionalist, which means that you can work with different deities from different pantheons or different traditions, but you see those two things are separate. You don't mix together Hecate and Cernunnos, for instance, but you may work with Hecate in a sort of reconstructed Hellenic way, and work with Cernunnos in a Wiccan way, for instance. And that would be multi-traditionalism, whereas an eclectic approach would be to work with both of them at the same time, which is also something that you find. I'm not saying that eclectic pagans don't exist anymore. They very much exist. But I think that there is a trend towards more traditional approach.
How many pagans are there in Europe?
It's impossible to say. That's one of the things that we had a lecture at the university, I think a couple of years ago, and we had a discussion, my PhD supervisor and I, about how impossible it is to determine how many pagans are there, because pagans elude statistics, because some pagans would not identify as pagans. They would identify as druids or as heathens or as something else. So they would identify with one of the things that scholars would still consider to be part of the paganism umbrella. And there are also pagans that would say, oh, I practice as a pagan, but I don't want to use the label.
Sure.
So I think that paganism as a religious movement and the pagans tend to elude a little bit that kind of, type of research.
I mean, either in any sense, even with like a really big margin of error? Like 10,000 plus or minus 5,000, like even with a big margin of error.
No, I don't know.
Yeah,
I will have to look up the latest research, because
they're in the UK. They do pretty good polling around that stuff, I think, right? Like religious polling.
Yes, but there was the conversation that I was having was about religious polling in the UK.
Okay.
But I can't remember the numbers now off the top of my head, and I would have to check the latest research. But it is a growing religion. I think that I saw recently an article in the UK saying that paganism is the fastest growing religion. So it is a growing religion, and I think we will see more pagans, definitely. I don't see it ever becoming like as big as, I don't know, Christianity, but it's definitely a fast-growing religion.
Folks know what time our next event is downstairs?
6:30.
Is that the welcoming thing?
Yeah.
Okay. Great.
So we should probably wrapping up pretty soon.
I'm also hungry. Maybe people don't.
Oh,
I don't
yeah,
know. Eat
food. I forgot about food. This is the thing with these cerebral people. They sit around all day talking about the ontology of things and forget that we need calories to live.
I don't forget it.
I forget it.
Yeah.
This is an interesting question, and you guys just tell me when you want me to start pulling out questions and we can wrap it up.
Yeah.
Again, from Smashing Paper Tigers, is the growing tendency towards religion being individually tailored and eclectic, as we're discussing here, a unique product of our historical moment, or were there similar tendencies earlier in history?
I think it has everything to do with liberalism.
I think it has to do with the wide access to information.
Yeah.
Because in ancient times, you didn't have access to as much information about different traditions and cultures as you have now. You would probably know a very limited amount. You would have access to limited amount of information about religion. So you would either start with what you have been exposed to, or you generally had much less exposure to information. Whereas now, since we have the internet and YouTube channels and all of that, and talking about religion, you do all that. Nice segue. I think that's a massive part, because I can see, even in my research, with certain folk traditions that were very eradicated in the Italian culture, they are starting to become more eclectic because of the internet. For instance, I did part of my PhD research was on vernacular healers in Italy, and they tend to be more in rural places, in places that are not as much in communication with the big cities, and they tend to be quite local, and they were passed down from generation to generation without that much variation. But in recent years, thanks to internet, and that is admittedly on the part of these practitioners, thanks to the wide access to information, if you have been exposed to a certain tradition and then you read online about, I don't know, the goddess Diana, and you feel a sense that you feel drawn towards that goddess, you will say, oh, you know what, maybe I can try and incorporate this practice that my grandma did with the moon, and I can syncretize, and I can also work with Diana at the same time. So I think that the wider access to information is definitely one of the major reasons why we have a more individually tailored approaches.
I would say there are individual examples in history. I'm thinking of people like Kabir in India, or maybe Guru Nanak, the founder of Sikhism. And it's interesting because those were people who lived in an environment where they had access to all these different traditions, like Hinduism, or particularly Hinduism and Islam in this case. Whereas in maybe other regions of the world, it would be at least relatively more closed off in terms of information regarding other religious traditions. And that would really only speak for your point here, is that today we live now in an environment where most people have that access to all kinds of information to some degree. So I definitely agree with you.
I think it's also a function of how we conceive of ourselves since the 17th century as individuals. Many ancient peoples also thought of themselves as part of a community, and the unit of religious selection wasn't the individual, it was the community. So think of places like Alexandria, where at least in magical practice we see some syncretism, but in the actual religious communities there's not much blending. You don't, like the indigenous Egyptian religion, the Christians, the Jews, they'll saw themselves very differently, and you see very little cultural crossing over there, even though they had access to the information. But the idea was, no, I don't pick my religion. Like, that's not, it's a really community-based religion. And I think this survives in some traditional communities, where the idea is like, it's not about what I believe, it's about how my beliefs fit into a larger network of a community. And what's normative is actually what's about the community and not what I believe. Which I like that, I prefer that.
I think it's also a matter of cultural identity. I think that in the past there was more of a political and social need for having a strict social identity, like for instance as, I don't know, Italian or whatever it was. So there was a sense that you had to build that sense of identity via the tradition. And now with the globalization, I think that this need is less felt. So you can see that not just with religion, but even with other things like the cuisine. You know, now you see that you can eat the types of food from different regions and different countries, which in the past was not exactly something that you would find as easily. So you can eat sushi and then go to the Mexican and then to the Italian restaurant. So you have also the integration of different cultures, and it's not seen as a threat to your cultural identity. Whereas in the past, I don't think that you would have seen that much mixing in this way. Obviously, syncretisms have always happened, but it's not quite the same as the globalization.
It would be funny to meet a person who's like a culinary fundamentalist.
Italians.
One kind of
Italians. I mean, when I
it's like you have to be Catholic and you have to eat this food. And
Italians are very fussy about food. I'm Italian, by the way, in case I'm not particularly fussy about
maybe the places that have good food can be fussy. I think that
I shouldn't talk about my family too much. My mom says that outside of Italy is fake food. So you have to come back and eat real food, because what you have over there is fake food.
Maybe we do one more question, then we can start wrapping up.
Yeah, super chat here from before a question is from Seth Fee. Philip, please cover every page of Shams al-Ma'arif.
I'm on it.
it's
going to take like 2 decades or something, but
How much of the in the recent English translation? How much is covered in the text?
It's the first, I think, 8 chapters, which would be like maybe 10% of the text or something.
It's really a substantial volume.
Yeah, maybe a bit more, but it's just relatively tiny portion.
Yeah, it's a pretty monumental work.
Yeah,
which is also just grist to the mill of how much we were talking about this at the round table, just especially in the Islamic Near East context. It's a really huge gap in our understanding of, like, for those of us who include the Middle East and what is called the West, it's just a massive gaping maw of what we don't know and don't have translations for. It's amazing how, again, like how Islamophobia has just destroyed our, like, the narrative we all are carrying around with us is going to have to be so fundamentally revised that most of the work that we're doing now in the next 200 years is going to look really silly. It's going to look really primitive, actually.
That's why the scholarship of people like Liana Saif, who is here today, actually, is very, very important. I have the Arabic version of the Shams al-Ma'arif at home. It's like this thick, basically. It's a big, tiny type too.
Here is the final question, which is there's been a few questions around this. I thought we can pull them together. The question is from Zev. How would you advise me to build a group of people to help build a new religion?
Do you want to be like the leader of this religion? Like a cult?
Let's go with that.
A beard is a good start.
Yeah, they tend to have those.
No, seriously, I don't know. That's a difficult question.
I mean, I think it's not.
Why would you do that? Why would you want to do that?
You're a psychopath. I mean, I think we know pretty well how so-called cults operate, right? Separate people from their families, don't allow people access to contact, like love bombing, and then like, you know, these psychological techniques are pretty well understood at this point. The real sad thing is that there are probably people out there actively using them to, right? Also, I would tell people that these techniques, like I'm mentioning love bombing, other kind of things like that, these techniques are really well attested, and if you find yourself in a religious setting or like business settings also use these techniques to like build business solidarity. Like literally like corporate businesses have gone and looked at cult studies and been like, what do they do? They're like, let's do that to our, and I'm like, it's really sinister. Right. So I'd really encourage people to look at these like signs, and if you ever find yourself in any group whatsoever, whether it's a political group or a religious group or a corporate group, and you see them doing this stuff to you, run, get out of there. And also in relationships, like the same kinds of psychological techniques, like really harshly judging someone and then like showering them with love afterwards. It's a really well understood technique that like people do to manipulate people's emotions. It's really frightening.
Yeah, I kind of like the aesthetics, not what they do often, but the aesthetics of cults. And I was joking with a friend that we should start a cult with the acronym compassion, understanding, love, and tolerance. Kind of use the group psychology to try and make
That does
something
sound
positive.
like a cult.
I think also another thing, I wouldn't trust any cult leader that didn't have some badass clothes. I want them to have some really cool. That was the first thing when I looked at David Koresh. I was like, I don't trust that dude. He's not dressed cool enough. You need to have you need to dress somewhere on the Star Wars spectrum.
Right.
So who do you think of the four of us would be a better cult leader? Let us know in the comments.
I vote Philip. Philip is he's it's like the still waters run deep.
Yeah.
I would join Philip's cult.
Yeah, and Philip I bet you could pull you grow your hair out. I bet you get some great what's his name, the Russian guy?
Rasputin.
Yeah, Rasputin. I bet you get some good Rasputin stares.
Yeah.
You don't see this over the camera, but Philip has very piercing eyes in person there.
Right.
They'll put people under a spell.
So be careful so I don't. If I shower you with too much love, you know.
Yeah. It's
we thought that he was really happy to see us earlier, and it was just a technique.
It's a technique, yeah. No, I get it, Philip. I see what you're doing.
I was happy to see my initiates.
Philipism,
Yes.
Homism. It does sound like a religion. Homism.
Go. We have to get going to draft up the tenets of Homism.
Yep. We're gonna, in fact, begin the first sectarian fight.
Right.
the Philippian council.
Yeah.
Nice.
Thank you.
Yeah, we have to get some food.
Yeah, I think it's time to wrap up.
Some wine going.
Just want to express again, like we said in the last live stream, it's such a amazing honor and just a lovely thing to be able to have this community with you guys in person, but also with the audience, of course. It really means so much to us. I think I can speak for all of us.
Yeah.
That we have this platform to speak about things we are passionate about, and have you in the audience be along for that journey. We were in Amsterdam last week, at least the three of us. We got to meet some of you in person, and that also was an incredibly special experience. So thank you all so much for being there, for watching, and for engaging with all of our channels. If you guys aren't subscribed to these guys, you should definitely go do that right away. Do you want to pitch your channels?
Seekers of Unity, History and Philosophy of Mysticism, with an extra focus on Jewish mysticism, perennialism, and trying to look about how it might be helpful to us in a contemporary global moment, existentially and other ways.
My channel is Angela's Symposium, and I cover academic research and academic scholarship on magic, esotericism, shamanism, paganism, and occult topics.
I'm Esoterica, and my channel focuses on the academic study of Western esotericism, so Kabbalah, alchemy, magic, other stuff. Yeah, the Esoterica grab bag. Great.
Go subscribe. Thank you all so much for coming and being part of this live stream. We're gonna go get some food.
Cold.
Right.
Yeah.
Same thing.
Live.
They call it live stream now.
Thank you so much. We're gonna get going. Maybe you want to shut it off. Bye.
Bye.
Do you want to shut it off? Oh, there it is. And no?
They're not even